1767. Untold story about family Elijah Thornfield. 3 daughters become fathers' wives one by one. Deep within the state archives of Virginia, locked away for over 2 centuries, lies a leather-bound journal that chronicles one of America's most chilling family secrets. The journal, discovered in 1945 by archaeologists excavating an old colonial road, contains 712 pages of daily entries written in 3 different hands, all belonging to the same family. What those pages revealed about the winter of 1,767 inches, the remote Blue Ridge Mountains, challenges our understanding of survival, sanity, and the darkest corners of human instinct. The authorities who first read these entries immediately classified them, and for decades, the truth of the Thornfield family remained buried in government files, deemed too horrifying for public release. Before we continue the story of Elijah Thornfield and his 3 daughters, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Stories like these are the reason we dig deep into America's forgotten archives. And leave us a comment letting us know what state you're listening from, because the story we're about to tell could have happened in any secluded corner of this vast country during its brutal frontier winters. The discovery of those journals forever changed the way investigators looked at missing persons cases from the 18th century. Because what happened in that remote cabin wasn't just a tragedy, it was a systematic documentation of how isolation, desperation, and grief can transform even the most devoted family man into something no longer recognizable. Elijah Thornfield had built his reputation as one of the most successful hunters and farmers operating between Fort Chiswell and the Kentucky frontier. At 45, he was known throughout colonial Virginia as a man who could survive where others perished. A man who understood the rhythms of the wilderness and the delicate balance required to thrive in a land that killed the unprepared. His homestead, situated along the New River in the Blue Ridge Mountains, served as a crucial way station for hunters, settlers, and colonial patrols moving through the area. The Thornfield family represented everything that frontier families aspired to be. Elijah had married Abigail Thornton, the daughter of a Williamsburg merchant. In 1750, she followed her husband west with the determination characteristic of frontier women, teaching herself to preserve food, mend wounds, and maintain a respectable home when the nearest neighbor was 25 miles away. Their 3 daughters, 2 5-year-old Rebecca, 2 3-year-old Hannah, and 2 0-year-old Lydia, had inherited their mother's intelligence and their father's resilience. Unlike many frontier children, they were well educated, with Abigail insisting on daily lessons even during the harshest seasons. Rebecca, the eldest, possessed a near-photographic memory and served as the family's record keeper, maintaining detailed logs of hunts, weather patterns, and supply inventories. Hannah developed considerable skill as a healer and seamstress, often treating injured hunters who arrived at the homestead with animal bites, infected cuts, or broken bones. Lydia, the youngest, had an uncanny ability to predict changes in the weather and the behavior of wild animals, a skill that had saved the family from numerous dangerous situations. The Thornfield homestead was strategically located in a clearing surrounded by dense oak forests, with the New River providing year-round fresh water and easy access to major hunting trails. Elijah had constructed the main cabin with thick timber and a solid stone foundation, designed to withstand the brutal Virginia winters that could isolate the family for months at a time. Outbuildings included a smokehouse, a storage shed, and a small cabin to accommodate travelers. By 1767, the family had accumulated considerable wealth by frontier standards. Elijah held extensive trapping rights, maintained trading relationships with the native Indian tribes in the region, and had invested in several promising coal mines. The Thornfield name was respected from Williamsburg to the frontier, with colonial officers and officials often consulting him on conditions in the western wilderness. Abigail maintained a meticulous correspondence with her family in Williamsburg, and her letters from the summer of 1767 paint a picture of contentment and prosperity. She wrote enthusiastically about Rebecca's betrothal to a merchant from Fort Chiswell, Hannah's growing reputation as a healer among the local Indian communities, and Lydia's artistic talents, which were attracting attention from travelers who commissioned her to create detailed sketches of mountain wildlife. The social dynamics of frontier life meant that the Thornfield family lived in isolation for much of the year, depending on one another for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional support. During the long winter months, they gathered each evening around the large stone hearth, with Abigail reading aloud from books ordered from Eastern publishers, the daughters working on household projects, and Elijah sharing stories from his hunts or planning the next season's trading expeditions. This self-sufficient, harmonious existence had lasted for over 17 years, with the family successfully navigating the challenges of the frontier through the careful planning, mutual support, and practical ingenuity that distinguished survivors from victims in the unforgiving Virginia wilderness. Neighbors, though few and far between, regarded the Thornfields as a model frontier family, proof that civilization and refinement could flourish in even the most remote corners of colonial America. The 12th of October 1767 marked the beginning of what old-timers would later call the worst winter in the recorded history of colonial Virginia. The first snowstorm arrived without the usual warning signs that experienced frontiersmen relied upon. It descended from the northern peaks with a ferocity that caught even seasoned mountain dwellers by surprise. Abigail Thornfield was returning from the river, where she had been doing a final pre-winter laundry, when sudden gale-force winds knocked her from the narrow wooden bridge that spanned the rushing water. Rebecca's journal from that day, written in her precise script, describes hearing her mother's scream carry over the howling wind. The three sisters rushed out into the blinding snow, following Abigail's calls until they found her trapped beneath the collapsed bridge, her leg pinned by heavy timbers in the frigid water that was already beginning to form ice sheets along the banks. It took the combined effort of the four remaining family members to free Abigail from the wreckage, but by then she had been submerged in the freezing water for nearly an hour. Elijah carried his unconscious wife back to the cabin, where they stripped her of her frozen clothes and tried to restore warmth to her body, using every frontier remedy they knew. For 3 days, Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her body racked by fevers and chills that indicated the onset of pneumonia. Hannah's journal from this period reveals a growing desperation as Abigail's condition worsened despite their efforts. The family had limited medical supplies, and the nearest doctor was over 70 miles away at a settlement that would be completely inaccessible once the heavy snows began. Abigail's breathing grew more labored, and she began to ramble about people and places from her childhood in Williamsburg, no longer recognizing her husband or daughters during her brief moments of lucidity. On the 15th of October 1767, Abigail Thornfield died in her sleep, leaving behind a family unprepared for the psychological devastation of losing the woman who had been their emotional anchor and moral compass. Elijah, who had never spent a night away from his wife in 17 years of marriage, sat beside her body for nearly 10 hours, refusing to allow his daughters to begin the necessary preparations for burial. The practical challenges of Abigail's death immediately became apparent. The ground was already frozen solid, making burial impossible until the spring. As was the frontier custom, they would have to preserve her body in the smokehouse until the thaw, a grim reality that forced the family to confront Abigail's physical presence on a daily basis throughout the coming winter months. Rebecca's journal describes the surreal experience of moving her mother's body, wrapped in her finest blankets, to the cold smokehouse where she would remain for the next 6 months. More disturbing than the practical issues were the psychological changes that began to manifest in Elijah immediately following Abigail's death. Lydia's journal notes that her father stopped sleeping in the bedroom he had shared with her mother, instead spending his nights sitting in the main room, staring at the chair where Abigail had always sat during their evening gatherings. He stopped maintaining his personal hygiene, allowing his beard to grow wild and his clothes to become increasingly soiled. The first sign of a more serious mental decline appeared on October 22, when Elijah began to have long, detailed conversations with Abigail's empty chair, discussing hunting decisions, family matters, and daily concerns, as if she was still alive and answering his questions. The daughters initially attributed this behavior to grief, assuming that their father would gradually come to accept the reality of their mother's death and return to his normal self. By early November, however, Elijah had begun setting a place for Abigail at the dinner table, serving her a portion of food that would sit untouched throughout the meal. When Rebecca gently suggested that he stop this practice, Elijah flew into a violent rage, accusing his eldest daughter of disrespecting her mother's memory and threatening to ban her from family meals if she continued to make such cruel suggestions. The isolation imposed by the worsening weather conditions meant that the Thornfield family had no outside sources of support or reality checks during this critical period. The nearest neighbors, the Caldwell family, lived 24 miles to the south along a trail that became completely impassable as the heavy snows accumulated in late November. Colonial patrols, which often passed through the area during the warmer months, had suspended operations for the winter, leaving the Thornfields completely cut off from outside contact until the spring. Hannah's journal from this period documents a growing concern about their situation, noting that her father seemed to be disappearing into a place where mother still lived and where the rest of us were becoming strangers to him. She described finding Elijah arguing fiercely with Abigail's chair, seeming to respond to comments or criticisms that only he could hear, his voice rising and falling as if in a real conversation. As the November winds sealed the Thornfield family into their mountain isolation, the true weight of their situation began to settle over the remote cabin like a suffocating blanket. The accumulated snow had reached the bottom of the windows by Thanksgiving, creating a white-walled prison that muffled all outside sounds, except for the constant howling of the wind and the ominous growls of a bear pack that grew more aggressive with each passing night. Rebecca's journal reveals how their carefully ordered existence began to rapidly deteriorate. Without Abigail's organizing presence, the family routines that had run smoothly for years started to break down. Meals became erratic, with Elijah often forgetting to eat for days at a time, then suddenly demanding elaborate feasts in Abigail's memory. The daughters found themselves walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger one of their father's increasingly violent outbursts of rage. The most frightening change involved Elijah's treatment of Abigail's belongings. He had moved all of her clothes, jewelry, and personal items from the bedroom into the main living area, arranging them carefully around her chair as if she might return at any moment to retrieve them. He spent hours each day brushing the lock of her hair, which he had cut from her head before moving her body to the smokehouse, speaking to it as if Abigail could hear every word. Lydia's journal provides the most detailed documentation of how her father's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She described finding him in the middle of the night, sitting naked before the fire, having intimate conversations with the heir about their early courtship, their wedding night, and private moments that no child should ever hear. When she tried to cover him with a blanket, he shoved her away violently, screaming that she was interrupting an important discussion with her mother. By December, Elijah had begun to treat his daughters not as his children, but as unwanted intruders into his home with Abigail. He accused them of stealing Abigail's attention, claiming that their mother spent so much time worrying about them that she was unable to focus properly on her husband. During these accusations, his eyes took on a wild, unfocused look that terrified the young women, and his voice alternated between a childlike plea for attention and a menacing growl. The physical isolation was taking its own psychological toll on the daughters, who found themselves trapped not just by the weather, but by their father's increasingly dangerous mental state. Hannah's journal describes the constant strain of never knowing which version of their father they would encounter: the grieving widower who wept openly for his lost love, or the angry stranger who blamed them for Abigail's death and resented their continued presence in his life. The food supply, which had seemed adequate when calculated for the family's normal consumption patterns, began to dwindle as Elijah's grief manifested in either a complete loss of appetite or periods of voracious binge eating. The daughters discovered that he had been secretly discarding portions of the preserved meat, claiming that Abigail had told him it was spoiled and unfit for consumption. When they tried to reason with him, he became convinced that they were trying to poison him and Abigail, and he began hiding food around the cabin in places that only he could find. The bear pack, drawn by the smell of food and human presence, began to congregate around the cabin in unprecedented numbers. Lydia's artistic skills proved invaluable as she documented their behavior, noting that the pack had grown to over 25 animals, larger than any bear group she had ever observed. The animals seemed to sense the family's vulnerability, approaching closer to the cabin each night and creating a coordinated chorus of growls that served as an almost supernatural soundtrack to the family's deteriorating situation. Rebecca's journal from December 12 marks a significant turning point in the family's ordeal. She wrote, "Father spoke to Mother's chair for 3 hours today, and when he finished, he looked at Hannah, Lydia, and myself with an expression I have never seen. It was not the look of a father seeing his daughters. It was the look of a man seeing something else entirely. I fear we are losing not just Father's mind, but his understanding of who we are to him." The entry continued. He asked Hannah to brush her hair in the way Mother used to wear it, and when she complied, he watched with an intensity that made us all uncomfortable. Then he asked Lydia to wear Mother's red dress, the one from her last anniversary. When she refused, he became so angry that he threw things against the wall and screamed that we were disrespecting Mother's memory. But there was something in his voice that suggested he no longer saw Lydia as his daughter. He saw her as something else. Hannah's medical knowledge, though limited, led her to realize that her father was experiencing what period doctors called brain fever or a nervous breakdown, a condition that often resulted from severe emotional trauma combined with isolation and physical hardship. Her understanding of his condition, however, provided little comfort in the face of the reality of managing a full-grown man whose behavior was becoming completely unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The daughters began sleeping in shifts, with one of them always awake to monitor their father's activities. They discovered that he had been going out at night, often without adequate winter clothing, to visit Abigail's body in the smokehouse. These nightly visits lasted for hours, and when he returned, his behavior towards his daughters became even more unnerving and inappropriate. Lydia's journal from December 18 provides a chilling glimpse into her father's deteriorating mental state. "Last night, I followed Father to the smokehouse and listened outside. He was speaking to Mother as if she were alive, telling her how lonely he was, how much he missed her touch, how empty the bed was without her. But then his voice changed, and he began speaking about Hannah, Rebecca, and myself in a way that made my skin crawl. He said that we resembled her, that we moved like her, that sometimes in the dim light, he could almost imagine we were her." Christmas Day of 1767 marked the beginning of what the journals would later reveal as the darkest chapter in the Thornfield family's ordeal. Rebecca's entry for that day began with a prophetic observation. "Father woke us before dawn, insisting that we wear Mother's clothes for Christmas breakfast. He set 5 places at the table instead of 4, and when I asked about the extra setting, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, 'For your mother, of course. She'll be joining us shortly.'" The psychological strain of constant vigilance was beginning to crack the daughter's own coping mechanisms. Hannah's journal reveals that she had begun to experience severe headaches and dizzy spells, symptoms she attributed to the stress of managing her father's increasingly erratic behavior while trying to maintain some semblance of a normal family life. Lydia's artwork took on a darker quality, with her sketches depicting bears with human eyes and shadowy figures lurking just at the edge of perception. The most alarming development occurred on December 25, when Rebecca discovered that her father had been writing letters addressed to Abigail detailing a growing attraction to the young women who remind me so much of you. These letters, hidden beneath his mattress, contained graphic descriptions of physical desire and romantic fantasies that no father should ever have about his daughters. Rebecca's journal describes the horror of reading these documents, particularly Elijah's repeated assertions that God had sent his daughters to comfort him in his grief, and that Abigail's spirit had told him to accept their comfort in her place. Hannah's medical knowledge led her to consult the few books they owned on mental illness and nervous disorders. She found references to cases where prolonged grief and isolation led to a complete break from reality, with the afflicted person losing the ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate relationships. Her growing understanding of her father's condition, however, provided little comfort in the face of the reality that they were trapped in a remote cabin with a man whose moral compass had completely dissolved. Lydia's journal from the 1st of January 1768 documents the first direct confrontation between the daughters and their father's inappropriate behavior. Father cornered Hannah in the pantry this morning and tried to kiss her on the mouth, telling her how beautiful she looked in Mother's apron. When she pushed him away, he flew into a rage and accused her of being cruel and unfeeling. He said Mother would never have denied him affection, and that Hannah was failing in her womanly duty to provide comfort to the men of the house. The incident terrified all three sisters, who now realized that their father's mental decline had progressed beyond grief and confusion into something far more dangerous. Rebecca's journal reveals their desperate attempts to develop a strategy to protect themselves while avoiding actions that might trigger more violent behavior from their increasingly unstable father. The behavior of the bear pack had also become more aggressive and organized. Lydia's observations noted that the animals had begun to approach the cabin during the day, unafraid of human presence and exhibiting predatory behaviors that suggested they were actively stalking the family. The constant nightly growling had evolved into complex sounds that were almost communicative, creating an atmosphere of siege that added to the family's psychological stress. The food supply had now reached a critical level, with their father's erratic eating habits and wastefulness creating a genuine survival crisis. Hannah's calculations suggested that their remaining stores would last no more than 5 weeks, assuming normal consumption patterns, but Elijah's behavior made rational resource management impossible. He began hiding food in secret locations around the cabin, claiming that Abigail had warned him of potential thieves, and refused to eat anything his daughters prepared, insisting that only Abigail could be trusted to handle his meals. Rebecca's entry from January 6 reveals the extent of their desperation. We discussed the possibility of trying to reach the Caldwells despite the weather and the bears. Hannah believes she could survive the journey, but Lydia's small stature and my own lack of wilderness experience make the attempt extremely dangerous. More worrisome is the question of whether we could leave Father alone in his current state, and whether he would allow us to leave at all. The daughters discovered that their father had been sabotaging their winter equipment, moving their snowshoes from their usual storage spot, and hiding essential winter clothing. When confronted about the items, he claimed ignorance, but his behavior suggested a deliberate attempt to ensure that his daughters remained trapped in the cabin with him. Hannah's journal notes, "I believe Father understands on some level that his thoughts and desires for us are wrong, but instead of fighting these feelings, he is ensuring that we cannot escape from them." The most terrifying discovery came when Lydia found additional letters that her father had written not to Abigail, but to each of his daughters individually. These documents, hidden in the smokehouse where he spent his nightly vigils, contained detailed descriptions of a growing romantic obsession with each of the young women, complete with plans for courtship and marriage that demonstrated a complete break from reality and moral reasoning. Lydia's entry describing the discovery of these letters provides a chilling insight into the family's deteriorating situation. Father's letters reveal that he no longer sees us as his daughters. In his mind, we have become available women living in his house, potential wives who can replace Mother in every way. He writes about our physical attributes, our personalities, and our potential as romantic partners with the same clinical detachment he once used to evaluate hunting prospects. Most frighteningly, he seems to believe that Abigail has given her blessing to these arrangements through the communications he receives during his visits to her body. By mid-January, the daughters realized that their survival depended not just on enduring the remaining winter months, but on managing a father whose mental illness had transformed him into a potential threat to their safety and their virtue. The journals reveal their growing understanding that the man they had loved and respected their entire lives no longer existed. In his place was a stranger whose desires and intentions were becoming more dangerous by the day. The blizzard that began on the 16th of January 1768 would later be remembered as the most severe storm in the recorded history of colonial Virginia. But for the Thornfield family, it represented something far worse than a meteorological event. It was the final barrier between their father's deteriorating sanity and a complete moral collapse. Rebecca's entry for that day contains a single, terrifying sentence: "The storm has made escape impossible," and Father announced at breakfast that God has answered his prayers by ensuring his new wives cannot leave him. Hannah's medical observations provide a crucial insight into Elijah's rapidly accelerating mental breakdown. She notes that her father had stopped sleeping entirely, instead spending his nights alternating between passionate conversations with Abigail's empty chair and increasingly aggressive attempts to engage in inappropriate physical contact with his daughters. His physical appearance had become grotesque. His hair was matted, his eyes were sunken, and his gaunt frame made him look more like a starving animal than the respected frontier patriarch he had once been. The discovery of Elijah's marriage preparations sent a wave of terror through the isolated cabin. Lydia's journal describes finding wedding rings that her father had crafted from melted-down silverware, along with a crude marriage certificate he had written in a deteriorating script. The document, witnessed by Abigail Thornfield in the same handwriting, declared his intention to marry each of his daughters in separate ceremonies he planned for the coming week. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Blue Ridge Mountains intensifies. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Let's find out what happens next in this true tale of survival and madness. Rebecca's entry from January 20 reveals the family's growing desperation. Father cornered me in the storage room today and showed me the ring he had made for our wedding. And when I told him that a father cannot marry his daughter, he became violent and screamed that I was no longer his daughter. I was a woman living in his house, eating his food, and therefore obligated to provide him with the companionship that mother's death had stolen from him. His eyes held no recognition of our relationship, only a terrible hunger that filled me with dread. The systematic nature of Elijah's planning became apparent when Hannah discovered a detailed schedule he had created for the courtship of each daughter. The document, written in the same precise script he had once used for his hunting logs, outlined specific days for romantic meals, intimate conversations, and physical expressions of affection with each of the young women. The cold, businesslike tone of the document made it more terrifying than if it had been written in the language of passion. Lydia's artistic talents proved invaluable in documenting the physical evidence of her father's mental breakdown. Her sketches show the cabin's interior transformed into a grotesque parody of a romantic setting, with Abigail's belongings arranged as decorations for the planned wedding ceremonies. The most frightening image shows her father's bedroom, which he had redecorated with items stolen from his daughter's personal belongings, creating a shrine that combined the memory of his dead wife with his fantasies about his living daughters. The behavior of the bear pack had reached an unprecedented level of aggression, with the animals now actively testing the cabin's defenses during the daylight hours. Hannah's observations noted that the bears had learned to work in coordinated groups, with some creating distractions, while others tested for weaknesses in the building's structure. The constant presence of the pack eliminated any possibility of escape, even during the brief periods when the weather might have allowed for travel. The food supply had reached a crisis point, but Elijah's hoarding and wastefulness had created a more insidious problem. He began to use food as a tool of control and manipulation. Rebecca's journal describes how her father would deny meals to any daughter who refused his inappropriate advances, claiming that a wife who does not show proper affection for her husband does not deserve to eat. This psychological warfare through starvation represented a new level of calculated cruelty that demonstrated his ability to plan and execute complex strategies despite his obvious mental illness. The most terrifying incident occurred on January 26, when Hannah awoke to find her father standing over her bed, completely naked and holding one of the homemade wedding rings. Lydia's journal describes hearing Hannah's screams and rushing to her aid, only to find their father in a state of sexual arousal, trying to force the ring onto Hannah's finger while muttering prayers about fulfilling God's will. The three sisters were forced to physically restrain their father, an experience that left them all traumatized and certain that more serious assaults were inevitable. Hannah's entry from that night reveals the family's complete desperation. We can no longer pretend that father might recover his senses or that this situation will resolve itself with time. He has become a predator living in our home, and we are his intended prey. The man who taught us to read, who protected us from danger, who loved us as his daughters, no longer exists. In his place is something that sees us only as objects for its gratification. The daughters' attempts to reason with their father had become not just futile but dangerous, as any resistance to his demands triggered increasingly violent responses. Rebecca discovered that Elijah had been sharpening the kitchen knives and hiding weapons around the cabin, apparently preparing for the possibility that his daughters might try to resist his plans with force. His military experience from his younger days had taught him a tactical way of thinking that made him a formidable opponent, despite his deteriorating mental state. Lydia's journal provides the most chilling insight into her father's current mindset. When father looks at us now, I see no trace of a parent's love or protection, only the calculating gaze of a man assessing potential conquests. He has convinced himself that mother's death freed him from normal moral constraints, and that his daughters are his compensation for his loss. Most frighteningly, he seems to genuinely not understand why we would find his advances unwelcome, as if our disgust and horror are simply obstacles to be overcome with persistence and force. By early February, the daughters realized that their survival depended on developing a defensive strategy that their father's military background and intimate knowledge of their personalities would make extremely difficult to execute. They began sleeping in shifts, barricading their door with furniture and hiding makeshift weapons around the cabin. These measures, however, provided only temporary protection against a man who possessed both the physical strength to overpower them and the psychological cunning to exploit their emotional attachments and moral reluctance to seriously harm their own father. The 14th of February 1768, Valentine's Day, marked the culmination of Elijah Thornfield's complete descent into madness and the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt colonial Virginia for generations. Rebecca's entry for that morning contains what is perhaps the most chilling sentence ever written by a frontier woman. Father has declared that today is the perfect day for his wedding to Lydia, and that Hannah and I will serve as witnesses to God's blessing on their union. The final confrontation began when Lydia refused to wear Abigail's wedding dress, which Elijah had carefully preserved and altered to fit his youngest daughter's smaller frame. His reaction to her refusal demonstrated the complete collapse of any remaining paternal instincts. He struck Lydia across the face with a force that sent her crashing into the stone hearth, opening a cut over her right eye that would have left a permanent scar. Hannah's medical training proved crucial in the violent struggle that followed. As Elijah tried to physically force Lydia into the wedding dress, Hannah struck him with a heavy iron skillet, temporarily stunning him and providing the daughters with their first real opportunity to fight back against his increasingly aggressive demands. Their father's military experience and superior physical strength, however, made him a formidable opponent, even in his diminished state. Rebecca's journal provides a detailed account of the brutal fight that unfolded. Father recovered from Hannah's blow and came at us like a wounded animal, no longer speaking words, but making sounds I have never heard from a human throat. We fought him with kitchen implements, fireplace tools, anything we could reach. But he seemed to feel no pain and to have no recognition that he was fighting his own daughters. His eyes held only a rage and a terrible hunger that made him look more like a bear than a man. The fight raged throughout the cabin for nearly an hour, with furniture overturned, windows shattered, and blood spattered across every surface. Lydia's artistic skills allowed her to document the aftermath with terrifying precision, showing the main room transformed into a battlefield where the family had, quite literally, fought for its soul. The most haunting element of her sketches is the presence of Abigail's belongings scattered throughout the destruction, silent witnesses to the complete collapse of everything the family had once represented. Hannah suffered a broken wrist during the struggle, while Rebecca received a deep cut across her shoulder from a kitchen knife her father wielded with military precision. Lydia, though the smallest and youngest, proved the most effective at evading Elijah's attacks, using her knowledge of the cabin's layout and her father's patterns of behavior to stay one step ahead of his increasingly desperate lunges. The turning point came when Rebecca realized that their father's obsession with Abigail could be used against him. While Hannah and Lydia continued their defensive struggle, Rebecca began to scream that Abigail would not approve of his behavior, that their mother's spirit was angered by his treatment of her daughters. The psychological impact of these accusations temporarily broke through Elijah's madness, causing him to pause his attack and look with confusion at Abigail's empty chair. Lydia's journal describes the crucial moment when father heard Rebecca invoke mother's disapproval. Something changed in his expression. For just a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man he used to be, horrified, confused, and frightened by what he had become. But then his face hardened, and he said something that will haunt me forever. Abigail is dead, and you girls killed her by being born. Now you will take her place, or you will join her. The final stage of the confrontation occurred when Elijah, realizing that his daughters would never voluntarily submit to his desires, resolved to use force to achieve his objectives. Hannah's entry describes her father's systematic attempt to overpower and assault each of his daughters, beginning with Lydia as his primary target. The clinical detachment with which she recorded this event speaks to a level of trauma that allowed her to function despite the horror of fighting for her life against the man who had once protected her from all harm. Rebecca's quick thinking saved all three sisters when she managed to grab an oil lamp and threatened to burn the cabin to the ground unless their father backed away. The threat worked temporarily, but Elijah's military experience led him to realize that his daughters lacked the ruthlessness necessary to carry out such a desperate act. They would never voluntarily destroy their only shelter in the Virginia winter, even to escape his demands. The standoff that followed lasted for nearly 5 hours, with the daughters barricaded in the storage room while their father alternated between pleading for their cooperation and making increasingly violent threats about the consequences of their continued resistance. Hannah used her medical knowledge to treat Rebecca's and Lydia's wounds while they debated their limited options, remained trapped until the spring while fending off his attacks, attempt an escape into the storm and almost certain death, or find a way to permanently neutralize the threat their father now represented. Lydia's journal reveals the horrific decision that ultimately saved their lives. We realized that the man outside the door was no longer our father. He was a predator who intended to use our bodies for his gratification, whether we consented or not. The father we had loved was dead, killed by grief and isolation as surely as our mother had been killed by the river. What remained was something that would destroy us physically and spiritually if we allowed it to continue living. The final entry in Rebecca's journal for February 14 consists of a single sentence that captures the complete moral collapse of a once loving family. Tonight we learned that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the survivor as completely as death would have destroyed their body. The discovery of the Thornfield cabin in April 1945 by Forestry Service workers conducting a survey of an old trapping line created one of the most gruesome crime scenes in Virginia's recorded history. The official report filed by Ranger Samuel Thorne to both the Forestry Service and the Colonial Sheriff's Office described finding the partially collapsed remains of a frontier cabin containing the desiccated bodies of 4 individuals and evidence of a violent conflict that had occurred decades earlier. The initial investigation revealed the presence of 3 female bodies in the main room of the cabin, along with extensive documentation in the form of journals, letters, and detailed sketches that provided investigators with an unprecedented look into the psychological collapse of a frontier family during the harsh winter of 1767–68. A 4th body, identified as an adult male, was discovered in the smokehouse, where it appeared to have been deliberately placed alongside the preserved remains of a woman who matched the age and physical description of Abigail Thornfield. Dr. Edward Finley, the colonial medical examiner who examined the remains, determined that the 3 daughters had died from a combination of starvation and exposure sometime in the late winter or early spring of 1768. His medical examination revealed evidence of physical violence, including healed fractures and defensive wounds that supported the accounts of violent encounters described in their journals. More disturbing were the signs of prolonged malnutrition and stress-related physical deterioration that pointed to months of psychological trauma before their deaths. The male body in the smokehouse presented a different story. Dr. Finley's examination revealed that Elijah Thornfield had died from a single, precise stab wound to the heart that had been delivered with surgical accuracy, suggesting a knowledge of anatomy. The location and angle of the wound indicated that the victim had been conscious and facing his attacker at the time of the injury, ruling out the possibility of accident or suicide. Hannah's final entry, dated the 15th of February 1768, provided the missing piece of the Thornfield family's tragic end. Father is at peace now, reunited with mother in the smokehouse where he spent so many nights speaking to her spirit. We could not allow him to continue living with the madness that had consumed him, and we could not survive another day as prisoners in our own home. Rebecca held him while Lydia and I did what had to be done. He looked surprised at the end, but also relieved, as if he finally understood what he had become. The journal continued. We wrapped father in mother's favorite blanket and laid him beside her in the smokehouse, where they can be together as they always wanted. The storm has passed, but we are too weak to attempt the journey to the Caldwells. The food is gone, and the bear pack grows more aggressive with each day. Rebecca can barely walk. Lydia has developed the same fever that took mother, and my own strength fails with each hour. We have agreed that we will not become what father became. We will not let desperation turn us into monsters. H. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky hands by all three sisters, revealed their conscious decision to remain in the cabin rather than attempt an escape that would have likely resulted in death by exposure or bear attack. Their final written words demonstrated a remarkable clarity about their situation and a dignity that their father's madness had nearly destroyed but could not ultimately conquer. Lydia's artistic talents provided a final gift to investigators: detailed sketches of the bear pack that had besieged the cabin throughout the winter. Her drawings showed the animals in unprecedented numbers, with patterns of behavior that suggested an almost supernatural intelligence and coordination. These illustrations would later prove invaluable to naturalists studying bear behavior under extreme winter conditions, but they also served as a chilling reminder of the hostile environment that had contributed to the family's psychological isolation. Rebecca's mathematical precision extended to her final entries, where she calculated the exact number of days the family had been isolated: 132, the temperature variations throughout the winter, and even an estimate of the number of bears in the pack surrounding the cabin. Her final entry, dated the 10th of March 1768, consisted of a simple statement: "Today marks 147 days since Mother's death. We have decided that 148 will be enough." The investigation revealed further disturbing details about Elijah Thornfield's final weeks. Hidden throughout the cabin, investigators found more than 50 letters addressed to various women. Some were to Abigail, others to his daughters, and several to women whose identities could never be determined. These documents provided a deep insight into a mind that had completely lost touch with reality, constructing elaborate romantic fantasies and justifications for behavior that demonstrated a complete moral collapse. Dr. Finley's psychological assessment, based on the extensive documentation left behind by the family, concluded that Elijah had suffered what modern psychiatry would classify as an acute psychotic break, triggered by grief, isolation, and the extreme stress of frontier survival. His report noted that similar cases had occurred throughout the colonies, where the combination of harsh conditions and social isolation had produced breakdowns that turned otherwise moral individuals into dangers to their own families. The colonial sheriff's investigation focused on whether any laws had been broken by the daughter's killing of their father. The extensive documentation of Elijah's threats, violence, and attempted assaults, however, led officials to classify the death as a justifiable homicide in the protection of life and virtue. The case was quietly closed with no charges filed, partly out of respect for the victims and partly because colonial officials preferred to avoid the publicity that such a gruesome case would generate. Forestry Service records indicate that the cabin site was deliberately obscured and removed from official maps following the investigation. The bodies were interred in an unmarked grave at an undisclosed location, and all physical evidence was either destroyed or placed in sealed archives that remain classified to this day. The official explanation for this secrecy was to protect the family's reputation, but internal memos suggest that colonial officials feared the psychological impact that such a detailed account of a family's collapse might have on other isolated frontier families. The Thornfield case influenced colonial policy regarding winter isolation and emergency procedures for remote families. New regulations required hunters and settlers in isolated locations to maintain regular contact with authorities during the winter months, and emergency supply caches were established along major trails to provide shelter for families attempting to escape dangerous domestic situations. Local Indian tribes, when questioned about the winter of 1767–68, provided additional context that investigators found both fascinating and disturbing. Tribal elders reported unusually aggressive bear behavior throughout the region that winter, with pack formations and hunting patterns that differed significantly from normal territorial behavior. They also described hearing human screams and voices carried across the mountains on the winter wind, sounds that tribal members attributed to the spirits of a broken family, but which investigators now understood were likely the actual voices of the Thornfield family during their months of torment. The journals themselves became the subject of extensive study by colonial officials, medical experts, and early psychologists who recognized their value as a documentation of mental illness and family disintegration under extreme conditions. Public access to these documents, however, has been restricted due to their disturbing content and the graphic descriptions of incestuous desire and violence they contain. Modern analysis of the case has revealed additional disturbing elements that the 1,945 investigators did not fully understand. Handwriting experts have determined that some of the later entries in Elijah's hidden letters were actually written by Hannah, suggesting that she was forced to transcribe her father's fantasies as part of his psychological torture of the family. This discovery has added another layer of horror to an already devastating story of manipulation and abuse. Meteorological records for the winter of 1767–68 confirm that the Blue Ridge Mountains experienced the most extreme weather conditions in Virginia's recorded history, with temperatures dropping to -35 degrees Fahrenheit and continuous snowfall accumulating to depths of over 10 feet. These conditions would have made escape impossible for even the most experienced wilderness travelers, creating a natural prison that trapped the Thornfield family with their father's escalating madness. Wildlife biologists studying bear behavior have noted that the pack size and coordination described in Lydia's drawings represent unprecedented examples of predator organization under extreme environmental pressure. The suggestion that over 25 bears congregated around the cabin indicates that environmental pressures had forced the normally territorial animals into cooperative hunting arrangements that would have made any human movement outside the cabin almost certainly suicidal. The case has been referenced in numerous studies on frontier psychology, domestic violence, and survival behavior under extreme conditions. The specific details of the Thornfield family's ordeal, however, have remained largely unknown to the public, relegated to academic discussions and classified government files that few researchers are permitted to access. Recent attempts to locate the original cabin site have failed, with Forestry Service records indicating that the location was deliberately obscured and that natural processes have removed most traces of the structure. Local hiking guides report the occasional discovery of metal artifacts and bone fragments in the general area, but these findings have never been officially confirmed as being related to the Thornfield case. The bear population in the Blue Ridge Mountains declined sharply after the winter of 1767–68, with tribal reports suggesting that the large pack documented by Lydia Thornfield either disintegrated or perished during the extreme weather conditions. Modern bear reintroduction programs in the region have documented unusual territorial behaviors in areas near the suspected cabin site, with animals showing a reluctance to establish dens or hunting grounds in locations that appear environmentally suitable. This mystery shows us how the thin veneer of civilization can dissolve as quickly as it forms in the face of isolation, grief, and desperate circumstances. The Thornfield family tragedy reminds us that the frontier demands not just physical survival skills, but a psychological resilience that even the strongest individuals sometimes lack. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in those Virginia mountains? Leave a comment below and let us know what you think really happened during those dark winter months. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales from America's hidden past, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves a good mystery. The frontier holds many more dark secrets, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video.